Professor Michael Waldemariam, thank you for coming to the Nuzuri Kahawa report. We're lucky to have you, especially a geo-regional expert in Horn of Africa. Please tell us something about yourself, sir.
Sure. I mean, very briefly, I've spent most of my career as an academic. Uh, I'm currently a professor at the University of Maryland, the School of Public Policy, where I teach international policy, international security, and then a little bit on African politics, African security issues. Before coming to University of Maryland, I was a professor at Boston University, the School of Global Studies there. And before that, I was in graduate school. So I've been, again, in the academy pretty much my entire professional life.
Okay, Professor. So we're going to be covering the Horn of Africa in this episode, and we're going to be covering Sudan, the civil war in Sudan, Ethiopia, non-state actors in Somalia, Somaliland, and Eritrea. So I guess addressing the boogeyman in the Horn of Africa would be Sudan. How has the power struggle between the Sudanese army forces, the SAF, and the rapid support forces, the RSF, evolved, and what underlying political, ethnic, and economic factors continue to fuel the conflict? And addressing also, if you could address the regional but also the international actor component to that civil war.
Sure. So that's a big question, and as you are no doubt aware, there's plenty of commentary available on the conflict in Sudan, on its genesis, on how it's evolved. I would say I would really think of the civil war in Sudan as really having gone through two main phases. I mean, perhaps we could think of other phases as well, but I think of two main phases. I think an initial phase where the RSF really seemed to have the upper hand when it had effectively consolidated control of Khartoum or most of Khartoum. I mean, the government or the SAF forces occupied a few pockets, but not much. And then we're making forays into eastern Sudan towards the south. Had taken RSF had taken much of Darfur. So they really seem to be on the ascendancy, I think, in the first phase of the war, and there are many different reasons for that. I think the infantry capabilities of the SAF were quite minimal for a variety of historical reasons we could talk about. And they really seemed to be content to kind of position themselves in kind of isolated fortifications rather than going out and fully challenging the RSF. The RSF actually had quite a bit of freedom of movement. There are some sort of external interveners that we can talk about in a moment as well. I think really over the last 6 months, the tide of the conflict has shifted, and the SAF has begun to exert itself. They have sort of balanced the scales now in terms of some of the external backing that they're receiving. I mean, Egypt, Iran, Russia to a certain extent, at least from what the available reporting suggests. And they have then increased their infantry capabilities by just mobilizing forces, including not just within the SAF, but allied militia as well. And they have leaned, I think, increasingly on the old networks of the Islamist movement in Sudan and the NCP, the formal ruling party. And so now they appear to be on the cusp of retaking Khartoum in its entirety. They've already made some gains in the east, in Gezira. And then the question becomes, what next? Does the SAF decide to move west towards Darfur? It's an open question. Or does the fact that the SAF has kind of stabilized itself prepare the road for potential negotiations? I think it's an open question. So that's, again, broadly how I would say the conflict has evolved. Obviously, it's been a brutal conflict. Many people have been killed, millions displaced. I think the last I looked, it was the largest displacement crisis anywhere in the world, over 10 or 11 million people displaced. Really wanton violence against civilians. The RSF in particular has really targeted civilians in areas that it's occupied. engage in campaigns of ethnic cleansing. Of course, the SAF has not been immune to that kind of behavior as well. I mean, it's done apparently some pretty ghastly things as well. And then I think the other piece of this, in terms of how the conflict has evolved, is that we tend to think of this conflict in many civil wars as, or wars, I should say, in general, as kind of two-player games. But there are signs that the parties themselves are fragmenting as they have tried to raise kind of allied militia and mobilize various constituencies. So I think this is apparent with the SAF, but also really quite apparent with the RSF. Now, what are the drivers of the conflict? I mean, on one level, this was an elite dispute between elements of the old Bashir's old security apparatus, right? And the relationship between the RSF and the SAF was difficult from the beginning, right? From the moment that Bashir had made the RSF kind of a formal pro-state militia, and the many reasons. But one was because, on the one hand, Bashir was using the RSF to try and address various rebellions in the Sudanese periphery, in Darfur, in the Kordofans, in Blue Nile to some extent. But he was also using the RSF to balance against the threat of his own professional military and the risk that they might move against him. So this was an adversarial relationship, I think, from the beginning. If we go back to the 2000 teens, I think if we come to the immediate precipitant of the crisis between the RSF and the SAF, it was really about this question of how and under what terms they would be integrated into a single military force. I think when Bashir was ousted, the transition occurred. This was supposed to be a transition to democratic rule. The expectation was that Sudan would have a single military, and these forces would be integrated. And even after, the coup in October 2021 that toppled the civilian government, I mean, I think all Sudanese recognize that it was not healthy to have parallel military forces. So I think it was that issue of how to integrate that really raised questions of the distribution of power between the two parties and really triggered the conflict. There are, of course, ethnic dimensions to the conflict. I mean, the RSF draws from particular ethnic and tribal constituencies, particularly the Bagara in the Kordofans, in Darfur, but it's a transnational constituency that extends into Chad and Niger. The SAF has its own ethnic constituencies, tribal constituencies that it seeks to mobilize, particularly in riverine Sudan in the east. And so, again, that is one dimension of what's going on. And there's a long history of kind of ethnic politics and ethnic division in Sudan that one could talk about that is informing the present moment. But then there's, of course, the external intervention. Sudan in many ways sits at a geopolitical crossroads between North Africa, the Sahel, the Red Sea, and there are a variety of external stakeholders that even before the transition away from Bashir and his ouster have been trying to shape the politics and trajectory of Sudan. So in the context of the current civil war, you've got the UAE. I mean, the evidence is pretty clear here, backing the RSF. The conduit for their support has been for some time Chad, but there also is a Libya link as well. And then, a conglomeration of forces, backing the SAF to one degree or another, Egypt, perhaps the Saudis to some extent, evidence of Iran. Russia has played kind of both sides of the conflict, but there was a point in the Civil War where they at least formally began to back the SAF. Interestingly, of course, I mean, the UAE is a big supporter of the RSF, but it has its own economic linkages to the SAF as well. So the external involvement here is actually really quite complicated. So I think that's, there's more one could say about the evolution of the conflict, about its various drivers, but I think, maybe that's a useful snapshot.
So I guess an additional question to Sudan. So given the strategic location along the Red Sea and its proximity to fragile states, like Chad, South Sudan, and now Ethiopia is going through its own civil war. You could say, well, an undying civil war,
Mhm.
especially from the Oromo Liberation Front, and well, mainly from all that the Oromo Liberation Army. Then you have the Fano, the Amhara militia, but also you have unresolved problems from TDF, and let's not forget you have a large population Somali in the Ogaden region. Um, so, what are the broader regional implications if the conflict spirals into full blown? Well, it is a full blown proxy civil war, but what happens if it becomes? It already is a Libya 2.0. What happens if it becomes a Libya 4.0?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the big risk in Sudan is further regionalization of the conflict. I mean, it's already regionalized, right? But you could certainly imagine a scenario in which the civil war in Sudan becomes merged through various alliance structures with the civil war in Ethiopia. Or you could see, if we look to the West, a scenario in which, and this is all very speculative. I mean, we're identifying future risks and threats, right?
Yeah.
We're not there yet, but it's possible that you have some linkage between conflicts in the Sahel and the various militant groups there that then links up with the civil war in Sudan, and there is a potential. It's certainly been cited by a variety of Sudanese officials and actors of militant extremists kind of finding operating room within Sudan amidst the civil war and state collapse. Um, so uh, so that I think is, again, I think a real concern. Um, it's also possible that you see some of these Middle Eastern states whose interests are implicated in this particular conflict become further involved in the conflict. I mean, right now the involvement is not direct. I mean, the Egyptian military is not directly involved, at least not at a high level in the conflict in Sudan, but it's possible the longer it goes on, they see it in their interests to do so. So that's one kind of sort of metastasization of the conflict, I think, that we need to worry about. And then there's just the kind of humanitarian costs that are not contained within borders, right? Huge numbers of Sudanese refugees in Egypt, at the same time that they are potentially facing a big sort of big migratory flows vis-a-vis the situation in Gaza. A big number of Sudanese refugees in South Sudan, a country in South Sudan that really can't afford, is not really in a position to play host to large refugee flows. Ethiopia is in the same spot. So, I mean, I think that's kind of the risk. I mean, there's a risk that this conflict or has consequences beyond the internationally recognized borders of Sudan.
Uh, I guess I have actually before we go to Somalia and Somaliland, I have one out of the box question. Do you
Mhm.
think Russia might
Yes, and,
change?
and and feel free to go in any direction you want. No script here. We'll
Okay,
keep it informal.
okay. Um, do you think Russia might actually change the political and economic and the military calculus in Sudan if, now they're actually going to have a military base, a naval base in Sudan, and they're going to have actually a military base in southern Libya as well. It's very close to Sudan. Do you think, with the current political shift in U.S. administration, Russia will be much more preemptively interested in resolving the conflict by formally backing the SAF?
Mm. Uh, Washington backing the SAF or Russia? Sorry,
Negative. It would be Russia, since they're
Russia.
going to have a naval base in the
Yeah,
port of Sudan.
yeah. So I think two pieces here. It is true that Russia is kind of repositioning itself in Libya, and part of that is a consequence to the strategic setback that they faced in Syria with the ouster of the Assad regime. They are also looking, I think it's quite clear, for some strategic opportunities in and around the Red Sea arena. They have been exploring the possibility of a Red Sea base with a variety of countries in the Horn and Red Sea region. This is not a new thing, but
Yeah.
but many countries in the region have been disinclined to give Russia that opportunity because I think they see some geopolitical risks, particularly vis-a-vis their relations with the United States, other Arab countries as well. So I think, the Russians at some point approached the Djiboutians. I think they approached Somaliland. I think they've had a dialogue with Eritrea, although it's difficult to know exactly what the contours of that dialogue have been. In Sudan, I think they found an opportunity because, the SAF has been in a desperate position militarily, and I think wants support. But the SAF, the SAF engagement with Russia on the idea of a Red Sea base is not new. It goes back to the transition. And in fact, I think it predates the transition, might even go back to the Bashir era. And I think what the SAF is doing or has been trying to do is, I'm not sure it's actually committed to allowing a Russian base on Sudan's Red Sea coast. I think they've introduced the prospect as a way of saying to other actors, perhaps the United States, other actors in the West, that look, you should deal seriously with the SAF and accommodate us in the ways we see fit. Right? I think it's a way uh, of communicating with other potential partners, right? Because the SAF has, and we go back to the transition, and this was also an issue Bashir has had a challenge rehabilitating itself in the West. So this is a kind of circular way of also saying, I'm not actually sure a Russian base in Sudan will materialize, right? I'm not sure the SAF is actually committed to it. I think they may be trying to secure other kinds of diplomatic objectives, right, in the context of the civil war. But, I think from the Russian perspective, they obviously see their engagement with the SAF as leverage. And if they can parlay that into a permanent military presence in Sudan, I think they'll keep trying to do that.
Yeah, that's an excellent analysis. Addressing Somalia, if any country should have had a success story in Africa, should have been Somalia. If the recipe was ethnic hegemony, it is a homogeneous country. I think it's the only homogeneous country on the continent of Africa. That has more in common with Japan or South Korea than it does with any African country. Just one ethnic tribe divided into clans. But Somalia has been the most unstable country since 1991. So the question of Somaliland, Somaliland has declared itself independent, has not been recognized internationally as an independent nation. It remains unrecognized by the international community. What are the key regional and geopolitical implications of Somaliland's pursuit for sovereignty? And I guess how can this situation influence the broader part of Africa, particularly in relation to Somalia's territorial integrity? But after all, Somalia does not have as the means to curtail foreign influence in its own borders, so therefore they do not have the monopoly of violence.
Yeah, I think there's a variety of ways, I think, to approach the Somaliland question. Clearly, just to say off the bat, one has to admire on one level what Somaliland has achieved, right? Coming out of a civil war in 1991, then having their own internal conflicts in Somaliland, clan-based conflicts in 1992, 1996. But coming out of that period through a variety of clan peace conferences to kind of stabilize their country, their territory, their de facto state, and then converge on a participatory democratic system, a constitution in 2001 that put the country on a path to stability. Reoccurring elections in Somaliland, incumbents voted out of power, including recently. Certainly big challenges they faced, right? Internally, in terms of internal political infighting, some of the issues that they've had in the Sanag and Sul region. But, I think off the bat, one has to, again, kind of acknowledge and admire sort of the island of stability they've become in a very, not just, not vis-a-vis sort of Somalia, but vis-a-vis the region more broadly, right? So I think we have to acknowledge it. Now, the kind of de facto status of Somaliland is, I think, a regional challenge because you can imagine, and it has been at various points in time, sort of one vector of conflict in the region. It's a fault line that can potentially cause problems. And Somaliland, not surprisingly, is um, maneuvering in various ways to achieve international recognition. I'm not taking a position on that here at all. That's a complicated issue.
Yeah.
But as they maneuver, it creates the potential for conflict with Somalia, with Mogadishu, and the recent MOU. Um, Whether it's been retracted, we don't not clear of the status, but the recent MOU between Ethiopia and Somaliland, which from Somaliland's perspective was one way of moving further down the path of international recognition, basically created a regional crisis, primarily between Mogadishu and Somalia, but then it had broader regional implications because Egypt and Eritrea then came into play through a tripartite alliance with Somalia. So I do think, and then there's sort of the broader sort of tensions that have emerged now that I referenced before between Somalia and Somaliland over the Sanag and Sul regions. So again, it's the Somaliland issue is a fault line, and it unless it's resolved in one way or another, it can contribute to future crises, right? And there are just so many fault lines across this region, but that's certainly one of them. And I should add, Daniel, before I forget, I mean, as Somaliland maneuvers, right, tries to find ways to break out and secure international recognition, it's appealed not to just countries in the region, but it's seeking to engage internationally, right? Hoping to make progress with the United States. It's had a relationship with Taiwan. So, but if it makes progress on international recognition, obviously, that will create a response from Mogadishu or others in the region. I mean, it's a sensitive topic, and for Somali nationalists, it's certainly an issue that will provoke their ire. So this is a complicated situation.
Yeah, especially if Ethiopia does recognize Somaliland as an independent sovereign country, how does the Ogaden region play a part in this? What happens next if
The what region?
the Ogaden region in Ethiopia, which
Well,
has approximately, I think in Ethiopia they are, well, the Oromo are the largest ethnic group. Second are the Amhara. Third are the Somali who live in the Ogaden region. So therefore, how would that
yeah.
equation play a part?
Well, I guess 2 points here. I mean, one, it's not clear really what the status of the MOU is. Of course, Turkey brokered a detente, a de-escalation, if you will, between Addis and Mogadishu. It's not exactly clear what the terms of that are, what it will be. If the MOU has been fully rescinded, that I don't think that was actually in the text of the arrangement of the agreement that was of the communique that was prepared after the Turkish broker talks. Um, and there's also elements of the communique that refer to Ethiopian access to to the coast through Somalia through various means. So there's a lot of murkiness about exactly what has happened, but it does seem like there's been a de-escalation. But how would the Ogaden feature into Somali Khalil? How would it feature into this whole dynamic? I mean, there's a couple of different ways. I mean, obviously, if there were to be a conflict between Ethiopia and Somalia, unfortunately, we didn't see that. That region of Ethiopia would be front and center, right? I mean, that is basically the frontier between the two countries, and it's possible that you would see instability spill over in various ways. I mean, the leadership of the Somali region of Ethiopia was supportive of the MOU as you would expect, right? I mean, they are political allies of the ruling party, but one suspects that perhaps the population didn't necessarily feel the same way, right? And clan dynamics also may be relevant here, but to the extent that this was seen as an attack on Somali nationalism, then maybe maybe this wasn't actually a popular endeavor, right? That is the MOU in the Somali region of Ethiopia. So, but that's not actually something I followed particularly closely. But yeah, I think it factors in some of those ways.
Yeah, it's Somalia is I guess it's an odd case in a way because clan identity supersedes national and Somali identity. Uh, but going to the next segue and addressing the boogeyman in Somalia, Al Shabaab, uh, I guess how is that going to affect the security landscape? And do you think Somalia will actually be able to resolve uh, the current insecurity in its own borders without foreign intervention?
So on Shabab, I mean, again, I think we have to sort of acknowledge a few things up front. Somalia has made, if you compare the situation vis-a-vis Shabab today versus, back in 2012, 2011, Somalia has made some big gains through its own efforts and the support of, some of its international partners. Um, that said, Shabab remains a pretty potent, vigorous force, still capable of, controlling territory, able to launch attacks in various parts of the country, including in urban areas, although their urban activity, in particular in Mogadishu, has been limited in recent years. But they also are able to run kind of a shadow government in even areas nominally, that are controlled by the government, right? And raise revenue and extract taxes and so on. So they remain despite the gains, a pretty potent force. I think the challenge that Somalia faces going forward is really twofold. One is um, that that Somalia's political elite remains pretty divided, right? And a lot of this, if you look at the kind of evolving contestation between the federal government, various federal governments, this was true under Hassan Sheikh, this was true under Formaggio, but the tensions between federal authorities and the regional states, persist and are ongoing and have actually sharpened in recent years. So particularly, the issue of Puntland and Jubaland. And they've escalated to the point of actually military conflict. And so what you were seeing here, so part of the problem is a lack of coherence within the actual political governmental structures of Somalia that would be needed to actually suppress the Al Shabaab threat and deal with it on a sustainable basis. Because the fact of the matter, maybe this is too strong a claim, but some would make the argument that many of Somalia's contending forces see one another as a bigger threat than actually Al Shabaab, right? So that I think is a real challenge. Um, I think the other piece of this is there are signs that the international commitment, both from the big Western donors, but also regional states, is waning, right? And we went from AMISOM to ATMIS in 2022, and now we have this new AU mission as of January 1, 2025. And there's a progression, right? The idea is a more limited mission and the transfer of responsibility and capabilities to Somali forces, right? Um, but there is a concern that this is going to create a vacuum, and that Somalia's security institutions are not yet capable of dealing with the Al Shabaab threat without higher levels of external support. Um, but again, going back to what I said earlier, how do you develop a capable security architecture when the political system is divided against itself and the federal government cannot coordinate and collaborate with the federal member states, which is where a lot of Somalia's military capacity and governing capacity actually resides, right? So it's a very complicated. Again, I keep saying everything is complicated, but my bottom line is Somalia has made a lot of gains. Shabab is resilient, and there are big questions going forward about whether the effort against Shabab can be sustained.
Interesting. Yeah, well, Somalia is not the only complicated country. I think the Horn of Africa is complicated in itself. It's a paradox.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes.
Addressing
You
Ethiopia.
know, and I'll just add, you talked about foreign intervention. I mean, that also makes this a more complicated issue in Somalia, right? I mean, the kind of foreign intervention that we see in Sudan, I mean, we see elements of that in Somalia as well, with various Gulf countries and Turkey backing particular factions and actors, regional countries doing the same. And so those internal rifts that I talk about that need to be overcome to address the Shabab problem have been exacerbated by this external issue. I mean, I can't emphasize enough. I just want to underscore this point. The extent to which, and this is really a post 2014 after the Yemen war type phenomenon, the extent to which the merging of the security systems of the Horn of Africa and the Middle East has really transformed the Horn of Africa, right? It is geopolitically a much more complicated, contested terrain than it was, 15 years ago. And unfortunately, I mean, I think there is upside to Middle Eastern engagement in the Horn, but I think it's on the whole actually pretty destabilizing, right? Fueling a lot of local conflicts in the region that would otherwise be a little bit easier to manage.
Yeah. I guess addressing Ethiopia and Kenya in regards to Somalia. Do you think it would be in the best interest of the in a very Machiavellian way from the position of Nairobi and Addis to have a weak Somalia instead of a Somalia that resembles a Somalia pre 1990, a robust with a central government authority and also a powerful military. I don't think anybody, especially the Ethiopians, I'm pretty sure, uh, would not want uh, a strong, I would say, uh, in the 1970s, the Somalians were extremely close to actually conquering Addis, but then they got railed back during the Cold War. So therefore, they think there is a regional, uh, a complicated task of actually disintegrating Somalia, but not an entirely disintegrated, just militarily and socially weak state along the borders versus a strong state in Somalia.
Yeah. I mean, your intuition, I think, is not off base, and this is kind of strategic thinking that is not about any particular regime in Addis or Nairobi. I think it cuts across historically many different regimes. I mean, the fact of the matter is, Somalia has had historically difficult relations with those two neighbors, and I think there probably is a way in which both of them, prefer strategically a Somalia that is not a collapse state, not one in which they're all kind of there's disorder and all kinds of spillovers that would negatively affect their neighbors, but also not so strong that it could pose a challenge to their strategic interests, their vision of regional order, right? So I think you're onto something. And if you look at historically, for instance, how Ethiopia has engaged in Somalia, you can kind of see this, right? Where they have done a lot of work, obviously. I mean, to be fair, to contain the Al-Shabaab threat, but at the same time, worked and sometimes preferred to work very closely with regional subnational authorities rather than the central government in Mogadishu, right? And so you do see this dichotomy that again is maybe consistent with the perspective you're laying out.
Yeah. In addressing Ethiopia, I guess the current state of Ethiopia. So the civil conflict in Ethiopia, particularly between the Tigray Defense Forces, then you have the Fano militia, and you have the Oromo Liberation Army, the OLA, has fueled immense instability in Ethiopia. The Abiy Ahmed government only has the monopoly in violence in Addis Ababa, um, but outside the perimeter of the capital city, uh, those are regional militias or regional governments that have at stake in the security apparatus of the state. So, so how these various militia groups shape Ethiopia's internal security landscape, and what does the rise of signify about the country's future in terms of unity, national cohesion? Um,
Yep. Well, look, I mean, I think Ethiopia faces some pretty steep challenges, and in a way, in a way, pretty much, I mean, uh, every country in the region faces some pretty steep challenges, and we could talk. I mean,
Yeah.
we've talked about Sudan, Somalia. We could get into to Eritrea, South Sudan, but I think if I were to characterize the kind of political situation in Ethiopia today, I mean, you are absolutely right. I mean, there is a uh, I think insecurity is pervasive, right? Particularly in the kind of rural hinterlands. Um, and I think it reflects overall a kind of broader political stalemate, right? So, you have a variety of armed groups. At this moment, in particular, we should probably focus on the OLA and the Fano various militia groups in Ethiopia, who are contesting the government's authorities in key regions of the country. And the government has found it very difficult, I think, to fully suppress these groups, and there are a variety of reasons for that. The support they may have amongst their particular constituencies, the nature of these groups, particularly Fano, is not a hierarchical group that can easily, you take out a few elements of the leadership core and it collapses. It's not that kind of organization. It's also, the difficulty of suppressing guerrilla insurgencies in general. It's not it actually takes a lot of time and a lot of resources. Um, on the other hand, these groups and kind of opposition forces across Ethiopia more broadly are not really in a position, I think, to fundamentally threaten the power and the authority of the Prosperity Party and the Prime Minister. So they can, certainly disrupt, security and the government's writ in wide swaths of the country, but are not in a position to fully overthrow the prevailing order. And there are many reasons for that as well. I think one is the fact that the opposition in Ethiopia, broadly conceived, the armed opposition, but even the civilian opposition, actually has no consensus within it, right? And in fact, our if you look at OLA and Fano militia are diametrically opposed to one another in terms of how they conceive of their political interests and their ideology. So again, I think you get to a political stalemate. I think what Ethiopia needs at this point, what it's needed for decades really, is a serious kind of national dialogue and consensus building process, right? To sort of uh, where the various interest groups and communities and constituencies can kind of figure out a process through which to address this kind of age-old question of how they can coexist, right? And Ethiopia's never really had that kind of national dialogue or consensus building process, right? It's always been state building by coercion, um, and um, and that's I think that's just been an unfortunate reality, and that's not something specific to this particular governing apparatus, right? It's been with Ethiopia historically, and unfortunately, it's replicated throughout the region as well. State building through coercion is pretty much the norm across this region, and it is, I think, one driving force of a lot of the region's problems, right? And if you could have a more democratic, consensual model of state building, which is not easy, I think that would go a long way.
Interesting. Uh, well, the Fano is very decentralized in its
Yes,
military structure, and that's why it's going to be extremely difficult for the Ethiopian Defense Forces actually to suppress him. To
yes,
a certain degree, even all that's decentralized. Um,
yes,
the
yes.
problem with that aspect of that civil war is you have three main actors that are diametrically opposed between each other, but also they do have a confined space where they have animosity towards the central entity.
Yes, I mean they I think yeah, I mean there are shared interests, but also a lot of things that separate them. One thing I didn't mention, of course, is the situation in Tigray, right?
Yeah.
So we have the Pretoria Agreement. I think when the Pretoria Agreement was signed in November 2022, there was a hope that this would be a model of kind of peacemaking in other parts of the country. That hasn't really transpired, and indeed, I mean, the Pretoria Agreement, I think, was linked to the outbreak of the rebellion in the Amhara region as well. And I think we're at this juncture, the Pretoria Agreement is in a pretty fragile situation. Um, and and again, a lot of different reasons for that. I think core provisions of Pretoria have not been implemented. But we also now have the split within the TPLF ruling structures that has really, I think, complicated the situation. So that I think is, that's just another sign of worry. I mean, from the government's perspective, I mean, they obviously have their own vision of, they have a particular prosperity party has a particular vision of how they can transform Ethiopia. They've made a number of economic reforms, which I think, have, people have various opinions on those reforms, but, from their perspective, it given these conflicts, it's quite difficult, I think, to actually make the kind of economic developmental transformations that they are envisioning or proposing, right? So I think addressing these conflicts is really quite fundamental to really any progress going forward on any front.
Yeah, I guess I get how would Ethiopia transform itself without a truth and reconciliation commission similar to the one in South Africa that was implemented by Desmond Tutu? I
Yeah.
think wouldn't you think that would be a necessity to move forward past the civil war in Tigray, but also the regional animosity in order to create a national unity? I don't know even if there is such a thing in Ethiopia, to be honest with you, because uh, Ethiopia Ethiopia in itself, it's a multi-ethnic state where ethnic state boundaries and supersede any national Ethiopian identity to a certain degree.
Yeah, I mean, truth and reconciliation, or, we'll put that under the broader bucket of accountability, right? I mean, that I think this is a core challenge in any situation where you're trying to pull a country, a community out of sustained conflict, or, a period of kind of deep repression. Um, right? I mean, there are always issues around how do you deal with the harms of the past. And in the Ethiopian context, there have been plenty of harms perpetrated, right? Recently, and, even before the country's big transition in 2018. Um, there are various ways to approach this. I mean, the Pretoria Agreement, had made some gestures towards transitional justice, but I don't think the parties were fully committed to it, right? Because, transitional justice and the specter of accountability might seem quite attractive to us in kind of moral terms and may, resolve certain problems. But it also poses risks, right? To the parties that have been, involved in particular conflicts or repression in the past. So I don't think there's any clear formula how to deal with the question of accountability. I think South Africa is one model. Mozambique has had its own model. It's got to be sensitive, I think, to the particular context. I mean, there have been some places where literally issues of accountability, truth, and reconciliation have just been pushed aside, right, and not dealt with, and because it's simply too hard and carries with it the prospect of future conflict. Um, so it's a lot to think through there.
Uh, I guess in addressing Ethiopia's quest for access to sea is often viewed as a strategic imperative for Ethiopia, especially talking about Abiy's government. Do you believe this external pursuit is diverting critical attention and resources away from addressing Ethiopia's internal struggles?
Yeah, I mean, on the sea access question, which has been quite a controversial one. I think, I think you have to sort of see it from two perspectives, right? On the one hand, of course, I do think that sort of Ethiopia's concerns, right, around sea access have some legitimacy. And to be clear, these are also not new considerations, right? They go back many decades, right? Ethiopia's pursuit of sea access in some shape or form, right? It is now the most populous landlocked country in the world. They argue with some evidence that They're quite dependent now on Djibouti port, pay high fees, although the Djiboutians, I think, would dispute this, and that they run real risks in the in the context of some kind of interruption to access to that port, that that they would face like real kind of catastrophic economic outcomes in that scenario. And they've said, look, we've been trying to negotiate with countries in the region around obtaining sea access, but haven't really had much success thus far. But on the other hand, of course, the approach that the government has pursued in recent months and years, I think, may not be the most kind of sober, sensible approach, right? I mean, kind of implying or suggesting that you may secure a port via military force, then holding out the possibility of recognition for a de facto state, and then triggering a conflict with Mogadishu. Like these may not be the most effective approaches. So I think my bottom line would be, yes, I think there's some legitimate concerns around sea access, but they have to be pursued in conjunction and with the consent of neighboring states and sort of recognition of their sovereign rights. And I would just say, to get to the nub of your question, if sort of the pursuit of sea access triggers a conflict with neighboring countries, whether it was Somalia or Eritrea or whoever we're talking about, that of course would have big bearing on Ethiopia's domestic politics and the fragile situation the country is now in, right? It could be quite disruptive as they're dealing with their own internal security challenges, then to deal with a set of external conflicts. I mean, that strikes me as quite dangerous. And of course, a conflict would be quite dangerous for the littoral countries as well. It would not be good for Somalia or Eritrea or Djibouti or whoever else it is we're talking about. So yeah, I mean, some have also, made the argument that part of what Ethiopia has done, or this administration has done, is kind of it's sort of used the sea access issue to distract from some of its internal politics, internal issues. That's always possible. There's probably an element of that as well. But I do think, getting back to this, there are kind of fundamental questions, economic and security questions they face around sea access that are legitimate, but just need to be worked through in the right way in collaboration with regional countries, right? And sort of recognition of their sovereign rights and prerogatives.
Yeah.
So in other words, these are problems that can be resolved, I think, through dialogue and partnership.
Yeah, I concur.
Yeah.
In addressing Eritrea, so Eritrea has remained one of the most, well, but not now, previously politically isolated. Actually, you can say one of the most politically isolated, heavily militarized since 2001. And there is no clear succession plan for leadership. So given the aging leadership of Isaias Afwerki, what do you see is the most likely political trajectory for Eritrea in the coming years? Is there a possibility for internal upheaval or a transition to a more open governance model similar to Singapore, or
Yeah. It's very hard to say with Eritrea. I mean, I think if we were to think through transition scenarios in Eritrea, if there was a rupture in the current order, I mean, I think there are kind of two mechanisms that are possible. I don't see a popular upheaval kind of protest movement ousting the government as realistic because of the nature of the political system, right? So if change was going to happen, it would be through some kind of a rupture in the military and a faction of the military taking some kind of action, or it would be through kind of natural succession, right? The leadership is I think in the kind of twilight, and so you could imagine new leaders coming to the fore that might have a different vision of how to govern the country. But I do think there are a lot of risks for Eritrea, particularly when we think about the issue of succession. We have all the ingredients here, I think, for a potential crisis. I mean, a leadership that is that is aging, right? They've been around for a long time, and you don't really have the kind of infrastructure that could manage a transition in a stable fashion, at least from what we can see, right? I mean, we don't have an operative constitution. There's no legislature. I don't think there's an appointed vice president that we know of. The ruling party is not really meeting regularly or kind of functioning as an actual ruling party. So I think there are real worries about what would happen in the context of a transition. It's not just me saying that. I think many people are saying that, right? So, and the succession issue is also not exclusive to Eritrea. Very similar questions in Djibouti. Djibouti is a different country, of course, with different set of issues, but that issue looms, I think, in Djibouti as well, given the age of President Gelle and the uncertainties around who his successor might be. South Sudan is also in a similar boat as well. What also worries me, I think, about Eritrea is, it is strategic real estate, and has had, at least currently or in the past, difficult relations with some of its neighbors. And so you can imagine a variety of external actors from near and far seeking to shape a transition in Eritrea, and that really creating a degree of complexity that could really push the country in a negative direction. So yeah, I think there are a lot of issues potentially on the horizon.
Yeah. Well, given Eritrea's strategic location along the Red Sea and its historical and regional conflicts, do you think Eritrea could leverage its geography for economic and diplomatic reintegration, or will it remain isolated?
Well, I think the country under since 2018 has kind of broadened has rehabilitated its international relations somewhat, right? Not fully, but somewhat, right? So, the sanctions were removed in 2018 or 2019. I can't recall the exact year. When it was able then to, exercise outreach to other countries in the region, particularly Somalia. So from the government's perspective, its international relations, I think, have improved. And even before that, it had been engaging the Chinese and the Russians. It has not gotten to a place yet where it has fully rehabilitated its relations with the West. Yes, there are some Western countries it engages, Italy, for instance, but generally speaking, I think those ties have not been reconstructed. But obviously, from the government's perspective, Eritrea's strategic position on the Red Sea has been and will always be a kind of asset that can be deployed in appealing to or trying to develop relations with other outside actors. Look, the relationship with the Emiratis during the Yemen war is an example of what's possible. Russia's dialoguing with Eritrea, not just to dialogue with Eritrea, but because they understand its strategic relevance along the Red Sea. So for any leader in Asmara, this is going to be part of the calculus, how they think about their international relations. But that comes with a lot of dangers as well, in the ways that I described earlier. There's a lot of potential for getting entangled in external conflicts and external relations that are not really good for the country's long-term stability. But I do think with Eritrea, I'll just say two other things about Eritrea, my reading on Eritrea and foreign policy. Certainly we've seen, particularly over the last decade, that the Eritrean government likes to pursue maximal flexibility in its international relations, right? It's not one that is, given to permanent alliances, right? If you see the relationship with the UAE, for instance, or with Qatar, it was a kind of on again, off again relationship. So I think that's something to sort of observe. That seems to be sort of how they position themselves. But on the other piece of this is that we have a foreign policy that's quite under-institutionalized, deinstitutionalized, right? Foreign policy is basically personal politics. and it kind of operates, under the whims of one individual or a few individuals. And so you have a foreign policy that can actually be quite erratic at some time, at certain points, because it's not anchored in any underlying institutional structures and principles. It's kind of how a particular individual is feeling at a certain point in time. And so that's, that also creates a degree of instability. And I think it is one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons I think Eritrea has had some difficult relations with some of its neighbors, for instance, and others in the international community. Of course, it takes two to tango. I mean, Eritrea is in a difficult region, and some of its neighbors have not always been behaved in the best way. But I think that the under-institutionalization of foreign policies is definitely a marker of the system.
Interesting. I think I wrote an article about Eritrea, why Eritrea is actually the most unlikely strategic partner for the United States and the Horn of Africa in a very unstable region. And I guess I want to run this analysis by you. Is there a possibility that actually Eritrea might copy the Chinese model in terms of, bear with me, that Isaias Afwerki is going to step down while he's still alive and kicking, and there's going to be basically a one-state party? They're not going to open up the political spectrum, and another reformer similar to Deng Xiaoping is going to come to power, actually open up the economic sphere while maintaining the strong central entity. Do you think that would be a plausible option more than a democratic route in Eritrea?
It's possible, right? Anything is possible. And that would require, the president having some confidence in, and some trust, I should say, in the leaders that he is handing over power to. And then it of course requires, that apparatus, right, that the president has handed power over to, actually cohering and getting along with one another, right? And I think so. It's possible. I guess we'll have to see. And I think one of the challenges with personalist regimes, and I think Eritrea I would qualify as a personalist regime. I mean, I think many countries in the region are personalist regimes, right, where power is really centered around the whims and behaviors of a single individual. Is that you often don't see the development of actual governing infrastructures like a ruling party, right? I mean, Eritrea has a ruling party, but perhaps not in the way that it did in the 1990s, right? And there are also mechanisms of divide and rule. So I think one question is, like, what does that look like? What does that all mean if the president were to hand over power to a new, to some apparatus or some collection of leaders? But we'll have to see. Anything is possible. Anything is possible. So I don't want to discount your analysis. Maybe you're onto something.
No.
Yeah.
That was not the analysis that I wrote. Analysis was the Eritrean political elite are very pragmatic in their nature. They're not necessarily rigid in their political and economic domain, meaning that I made the self-evident switch between their alliance with Qatar, then Saudi Arabia granting UAE a military base. So when making economic and diplomatic shifts, they will make it radically and at a moment's notice, you might call it. But they're not necessarily ideologically entrenched with any political economic ideology, to be honest with you, at least the political entity as a whole. But I guess, in a segue to finalize the interview, the Horn of Africa, you have Eritrea, you have an aging leadership that is going to uncharted territory. You have Sudan, it's a Libya 2.0. Has been in civil war for the last 3 or 4 years, and is getting worse by day. You have South Sudan, which in an anomaly way is much more stable than Sudan itself, but yet it is ethnically divided, and Ethiopia, it's in the midst of a unfinalized civil war, and you have some worry about regional disintegration and the balkanization of Ethiopia, which they worry has it's self-evident that there's that possibility. Then you have Somalia, uh, which has been a failed state for the last 3 decades. So therefore, in your analysis, where is the Horn of Africa heading? It seems a very bleak future, to be honest with you. But is the complexity of the Horn of Africa has been this way, but this I have a hard time making sense of the Horn of Africa sometimes. So if you can enlighten me and the audience, would be much appreciated.
Yeah, I mean that's a big question. I mean, I think the region is in a difficult spot at the current time. I mean, instability has been the norm, but this level of instability, I think it's been quite some time since we've seen it. I mean, just across the board, every country you go to, there are pretty steep challenges. But one has to be, banging your head against the wall. I guess is not the right way to approach this. I mean, you have to try and find what the opportunities are for peacemaking and stabilizing the various countries. I think so. I don't know what that looks like, but I do think we have to recognize the way in which regional order has changed pretty dramatically over the last 15 years, and that this regional security complex that is the Horn, and I made this point earlier, really has become merged in a subordinate way, unfortunately, with the regional security complex in the Middle East. And so any solutions that we think about to the region in terms of facilitating peace, whether it's in Sudan, whether it's, if we look at Eritrea, Ethiopia tensions now, or in Somalia, we have to appreciate that those actors, the Gulf actors, Turkey, are going to be quite relevant. They're big time shapers of regional dynamics, perhaps bigger shapers than the big players in the global system. The United States, frankly, is kind of disengaged from the Horn of Africa, to be honest. China, even Russia, though they're relevant, but I think the Middle Eastern players are really quite important. And so we kind of have to recognize that underlying strategic reality and try and build that into any approach. The other thing I'll say is that we've got to rebuild regional multilateralism. IGAD, the African Union, or maybe it's something beyond these legacy institutions. It would probably be helpful to have regional multilateral mechanisms for the Red Sea that bring together Horn countries and Middle Eastern countries. We have to begin reimagining what regional architectures look like in this particular part of the world. And then the final thing I'll say, and perhaps I'm too optimistic, but this has always been my feeling. I mean, we have to understand that regional peace and security cannot be divorced from the actual aspirations, conditions of people across the region. And so reform, more inclusive, participatory governments, I think, are the basis of real peace and security across this region. So, I mean, we're not going to get there without, I think, a reasonable foundation. So that's just my perspective.
Okay, so if you can give us one bonus analysis, you're talking
Yes.
about the influential. You're talking about the influence of middle powers, and I do agree with you. I think Washington has been extremely disengaged with the Horn of Africa, and I think with this administration, they're just going to continue their disengagement. And from the middle powers, there's taking consideration Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the UAE. What do you think is going to have a broader influence in the region?
Between those countries?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. I mean, I think right now, I think you have to point to the UAE and Turkey because they've been the most aggressive in making their presence felt across the region. The Saudis, for a lot of different reasons, seem a little bit more restrained. Qatar as well. I mean, Qatar, I think, particularly after the Gulf crisis, and they were able to re-solidify their relations with Saudi Arabia, are a little bit more careful about how they engage in the Horn. But the most willing and aggressive participants in kind of the geopolitics of the Horn amongst the MENA countries right now, I think, are Turkey and the UAE. I mean, to the extent that, I mean, the Egyptians obviously are worried. I mean, they have the Nile angle, but they don't necessarily have the tools or capabilities that the UAE or Turkey even have at this point in time. And and the Saudis, I think, again, I mean, I think they just have other priorities at the strategic priorities at this point in time. So yeah, that's where I would put the hierarchy of influencers: UAE and Turkey.
Interesting. Well,
Yeah.
Professor Waldemariam, thank you very much. We would like to thank you on behalf of the Nuzuri Kahawa report on giving us an analysis snapshot on Horn of Africa, and hopefully you're back with us soon, giving us
Yeah.
another glimpse on Horn of Africa.
Yeah. No, thanks for the conversation, Daniel.
Yes, sir.